Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to yet another Warhammer 40k video. Today, we are going to be covering the Eldar. It's been quite a while since I've done the good guy elves now. I've done some dark elves, I've done some dark Eldar, but the poor little good knife is, it's been a while. So, let's take another look at their aspect warriors with the Howling Banshees. These mostly, although not all, hashtag not all, female warriors are shock troops and melee experts. They are used by the armies of the Eldar Craft Wolves when they need something to hit fast, hit hard, and then get the hell away before the enemy can punch back. Not a particularly fair way to fight, mind you, but when you're wearing tissue paper for armor and you've got a giant red mane of hair on your head, getting out of the way of any incoming firepower might be a good idea. And we are of course going to talk a bit about their tactics and the way they are employed, their weapons, etc. But first, let's do some mythical backstory, shall we? The Howling Banshees, as with all Eldar aspect warriors, are based upon one of the many aspects of that Eldar war god, Keala Menshur Kane. In this case, his ability to instill fear in his foes by yelping at them really, really loudly. However, interestingly enough, they were not originally an aspect of Keala Menshur Kane. In fact, they come from another Eldar deity entirely. They were once known as the daughters of the Eldar goddess Reeeee. This was a somewhat moody goddess. She was a goddess of knowledge, but not all knowledge is good, and this is where the Banshees come in. The Banshees would haunt the Eldar, and their ethereal screams would tell them when their lives were about to end. Now, as some of you may know, in several cases of European folklore, we do have mentions of our own Banshees. The take on them can be quite different. In some cases, for example, they are viewed as benevolent spirits, arriving to take away the soul of a loved one and guard them on their way to heaven, etc. In other cases, they are viewed as very, very malicious spirits, who, rather than coming to take away the soul of somebody who dies peacefully, might instead be the heralds of unnatural and brutal death through accident, war, disease, such things. In Eldar mythology, it is most definitively the latter. The howl of the Banshee does not mean good things. It does not mean quiet death. It means lots of screaming, bloodshed, and dismemberment. As you can probably tell from that, all knowledge is indeed not necessarily good knowledge. However, Reeeee herself had apparently not quite realized this. The knowledge flowed in her blood, and she wanted access to all of it, which, interestingly enough, she couldn't get through just, being in possession of her blood. It had to be ingested. However, gods cannot hurt other gods, and that means that no matter how emo a god is, Reeeee couldn't simply just start cutting herself. The only god who could hurt another god was Keala Menshur Kane. And as such, Reeeee decided to torture the poor bastard until finally he decided to hurt her enough that she could drink her own blood. Now, this is a little bit of a roundabout strategy in my opinion. Imagine this scene. Your sister comes to you and asks, "Hey bro, could you prick my finger please?" You might be a little bit confused, but in all due likelihood you'd go, "Alright." I mean, it's not like it's going to do any permanent damage after all. It's a bit of a confusing and unusual request, but no particular harm done, and hey, a fair few of you sadistic fucks might even enjoy it. If, however, she was to approach you with a slightly different request, something along the lines of, "Hey bro, could you please chop my fucking hand off?" you might not agree quite so readily. All I'm saying is, this could have been resolved fairly peacefully. Reeeee could simply have gone over Keala Menshur Kane and said, "Hey, prick my finger." And being the contrarian little bastard that he is, he'd probably whinge about it a little bit, but he'd probably also do it. Whilst chop my hand off, well, there is a bit of a difference in severity of these two requests, isn't there? One is a mild and highly temporary pain with little to no inconvenience. The other is a rather more severe type of pain that lasts for a fair bit longer, and it can result in some pretty fucking severe inconveniences. But hey, they are Eldar deities, and so nobody should ever expect them to even be mildly competent at diplomacy or doing something that makes kind of sense. So, Morai Heg decided to send her screaming little banshees to annoy the shit out of Caleb and Chicane, the god of war, until he decided, you know what, I will chop your bloody hand off. So basically, this is the tale of a self-harming sister who sends her screamy bitch friends to bug the shit out of her brother until finally he's had enough and decides to help his sister in self-harming. What a heartwarming family story. Anywho, after the chop-chop had been done, Cain gained the aspect of the Banshee. Apparently he'd been bitched at for so long and so often that he'd learned how to bitch back. Impressive, really. But that, of course, is only the mythical origins of the Howling Banshees. How did they actually come about? Well, as the other aspects, they came across as a result of Azurman and his disciples, in this case, Jane Zar, the Storm of Silence, who travelled from craftworld to craftworld, founding Howling Banshee temples, who would then train coming generations of Howling Banshees and, of course, their exarchs. At these temples, the various aspirants learn how to fight in the style of Howling Banshees and learn how to utilize their equipment. Like several other aspects, they are given lightweight bodysuits created from synthetic material and reinforced with plates of psychosensitive bioplastique. This is a rather interesting substance, as it is capable of detecting incoming kinetic energy and hardening to resist it. But not only that, it can also grow soft and flow across the body of the wearer, allowing for incredible amounts of movement and flexibility. Additionally, it can also be used to weight a strike. Let's for example say that the power sword of the Howling Banshee is screaming down towards the neck of something large and burly and unmistakably orcish. Then the piddly-widdly arms of a pathetic little Eldar might not be enough to take its head off before the orc decides to do something about the screaming creature that is sitting on its neck chopping at its skull. However, if the armor were to move most of its weight onto the Banshee's hands, then the extra weight might just be enough to decapitate the fungus monstrosity before it has a chance to squish the screaming Eldar. It also has various uses in mobility. For example, there are tales of Howling Banshees quite literally running across water. Apparently, this is achieved by essentially creating large blisters filled with air that are made up of the psychoreactive plastic underneath the feet of the Howling Banshee. This allows them to essentially run across water. And of course, this can be used in many other situations. Let's, for example, say that the unfortunate Eldar have been ordered to charge up a mountainside covered with snow. And take my word for it, as somebody who has to regularly drag his miserable ass through meters of goddamn snow, that is not something you do with any kind of speed or elegance. However, the Howling Banshees are able to do just that, by again moving the armoured plates on their bodies to create improvised snowshoes. Now, bear in mind that the more armour they move off for mobility purposes, the less armour they have for protective purposes, but that is where the speed and agility of the Eldar come into play. Unsurprisingly, it can be rather difficult to hit a target that runs at high speeds and bounces all over the place like a rabbit on methamphetamines. And due to the unique properties of Eldar body armor being able to harden upon impact, a glancing hit simply will not do. To reliably put down a Howling Banshee, you need a nice big meaty impact somewhere around center mass, or if you're feeling particularly lucky, you could go for the legs, although that is an even smaller target. But it is important to remember, and the Howling Banshees do, that no matter how spinny, poppy and jumpy you are, it's not going to help for too long against a large number of machine guns. Sooner or later, something's going to hit you, and the moment you stop moving to, for example, cry out in pain due to a bolt round tearing off your shoulder, a couple more rounds are likely to hit you before you can start moving again. And whilst Eldar body armor is remarkably effective considering its weight and flexibility, it is by no stretch of the imagination indestructible and will offer relatively limited protection against most of the small arms employed in the 41st millennium. It'll stop a few glancing hits, and it might even save the Eldar inside from 1 or 2 direct hits if the bastard is particularly lucky, but it is most certainly nothing to be relied upon. This is not power armor, and the wearer cannot simply just wander into the teeth of the enemy's heaviest firepower. This is, of course, where another rather famous piece of Howling Banshee kit comes into use, the Howling Banshee mask itself. This lovely little piece of extreme screaming technology is a way of amplifying the Howling Banshee's voice to excruciating levels, in fact, to such levels that it will stun most living creatures' neural networks for a few valuable seconds. And whilst that might not sound like a particularly long time, and, well, it isn't, but considering that these warrior bitches run at speeds that will make Usain Bolt look like a drugged turtle, that is more than enough. Oh, and I almost forgot. One little side note on the armor again, by the way. Yes, all of them have tits. That is because the Banshee in Eldar myth are the daughters of Murai Heg. They are all female. That does not mean that a Howling Banshee cannot be male, in fact they can, but even if the Howling Banshee in question is a male, he is still supposed to represent this aspect of Keela Mencha Kane, and since it is a female aspect, it necessarily must have female forms. And so, with that out of the way, let's move on to their weapons. The primary weapon of the Howling Banshee is a power sword. Now, way back in the day of metal miniatures, there was also a Howling Banshee with a power axe, but these days those are rather rare, so we'll go with the power sword as their primary weapon. This is a long, edged cutting tool that is of course enveloped in a force field, allowing it to slice through flesh, bone, and armor with relative ease, even though it is swung by the relatively puny arm of an Eldar. And that's pretty much all there is to their power swords. Nothing particularly interesting, those two, but should an Eldar be so unfortunate, relatively speaking, as to be trapped in the path of the Howling Banshee, and eventually become an exarch, they do have a couple of additional weapons. One is a power glaive, which is a rather massive weapon, and is capable of splitting most foes in half, meaning it's rather useful against big burly things like orcs or Chaos Space Marines. Then there is also the art of the mirror swords. This is a specialized art that Howling Banshee's exarchs might master, where they utilize 2 power swords instead of 1 in a specialized fighting style where they swing them so quickly it appears as if they are simply shimmering through reality, thereby the term mirror swords. They do also technically have access to 2 types of ranged weapons, although only one of them is ever used in any kind of real quantity. The strange one out is the Triskele. This is essentially the massive shuriken-like thing that Jane Sar is using, although that one is called the Janas Mor Silent Death. This is a rather silly-looking weapon in my opinion, since something that big, that cumbersome, and that jagged would be an absolutely awful ranged weapon. Regardless of how you look at it, it'd be cumbersome, it'd be uncontrollable, it most definitely wouldn't be returning to your hand anytime soon, and it'd probably get stuck in the body of the first person you threw it at. But hey, details. It looks cool, and that's all that really matters. It's basically a giant shuriken after all, and who doesn't love shurikens? The second one is the actual shuriken weapon, the shuriken pistol. I still love the fact that the Eldar are so weeaboo that a primary ranged firearm fires literal shurikens. That is dedication to weeabooism that is not seen on this plane of existence. Oh, I do mock, but to be fair, the shuriken pistol is actually a really effective ranged weapon, due to 2 primary factors. One, it's solid core ammunition. This is simply just a block of wraithbone that the weapon is capable of slicing off monomolecular slices of and then firing. This means that the weapon has a ton of ammunition, since every single shuriken is actually a ridiculously thin piece of wraith bone. This also means that the weapon is capable of a ridiculous rate of fire. Think of it essentially as a very small Uzi with practically no recoil whatsoever that fires monomolecular discs, which are, of course, by definition, razor goddamn sharp, which means that they are able to tear through practically any form of body armor. Now, let's for a moment here take a step aside and actually bring some real-life science into this, because it is always fun to ruin somebody's day with science, and I do it to Star Wars all the time, so it's only fair that I do it to 40k occasionally as well. Now, if the disc fired from the shuriken pistol was actually monomolecular, I'm going to have to re-record that word about 20 times every time I'm saying it, by the way, just so you know my suffering. Anyways, if it was actually that thin, let's just go with that, one single molecule thick, or smaller, then it would by definition be able to cut through literally anything with absolutely no resistance, since it would not be cutting through the molecules or parting strands of molecules. It would literally just be pushing two molecules apart. This would mean that it could cut through a block of solid steel just about as easily as it could cut through a piece of paper. Now, this, of course, would mean that the shuriken pistols would be a lot more powerful than they actually are. The question then is, do the Eldar use the word monomolecular just because it sounds cool, or because they actually are monomolecular, and the game simply just doesn't reflect the ridiculously overpowered cutting potential because at the end of the day, it is a game? It's probably a combination of both of them. Though, by the way, monomolecular cutting edges aren't actually quite as sci-fi as they might sound. They actually occur relatively naturally in nature, not actually monomolecular edges, but close. Obsidian, for example, is famously sharp, and that is, in fact, quite the understatement. Some experiments have shown that it is possible to get the cutting edge of an obsidian weapon down to 3 nanometers. Now, that would still make it somewhere along the lines of 10 times as thick as an actual molecule, but still, that is relatively close. So, in all due reality, we're not actually that far away from a monomolecular blade. Or, well, we actually are. We are fucking miles away. I'm saying it's only 10 times as large, but it is far beyond anything available to modern science to actually reduce the blade by 10 times, but, you know. It is an interesting side note, or at the very least I thought it was an interesting side note. So, back to the fantasy weapons. A shuriken pistol is really a pretty damn good weapon for a Howling Banshee, simply due to its sheer rate of fire. When you're closing with the enemy and need to get into combat as quickly as possible, you have 3 tools in the case of the Howling Banshees. One, of course, the Howling Banshee Shrieks, which is capable of screwing with the enemy's nervous system and scaring the absolute shit out of them. And of course, being shitting in your pants scared is not particularly conducive to aiming well. Secondly, they move extraordinarily fast, and thirdly, they have pistols capable of spitting out thousands of these little discs every single minute, essentially giving every single charging Banshee their own miniature machine gun, and as we all know, suppressing fire tends to be rather effective. But, I hear you ask, if the Eldar have weapons like this, why would they bother getting into melee in the first place? Ah, good question. Now, I've actually touched upon this in a little mini-series I did fucking ages ago with terrible audio quality, so be warned, but there are actually several reasons for why melee weapons are still used and effective in Warhammer 40k. In the case of the Howling Banshees, that would be a relative advantage. To put it relatively simply, let's say that you have an Eldar standing 100 meters away from an Imperial Guardsman, and they were both simply just shooting at each other. In this exchange, the Eldar would have a small advantage, simply because the Eldar brain is capable of acting faster than the human brain. They are also more agile and a bit quicker in physical movement. This would mean that the Eldar could potentially run around jumping and reacting to the enemy's movements to get out of the way of the incoming fire. Now, of course, seeing as a projectile travels rather quickly, I'm not saying they can dodge the actual energy blast itself in the case of a lasgun, but they would be able to see the movement of the weapon and not be where the weapon is pointing. But at the end of the day, against a lasgun on full auto, this is at best a small advantage, since dodging a full automatic weapon is rather difficult, particularly when it's a lasgun and the projectile crosses the distance between the Eldar and the lasgun in literal nanoseconds. In other words, in this confrontation, the Eldar would have a tiny advantage, but if both of them were in close quarters combat, the Eldar had a sword and the human had a sword, then the Eldar will have a much greater advantage. Not only is the Eldar faster, he can also react considerably faster to any movement his opponent makes. This means that he is capable of striking at his enemy much quicker, with much greater accuracy, much greater dexterity, and he's also able to get out of the way of his enemy's weapon. This is a slightly smaller advantage if the enemy is using a bayonet and again using the full auto lasgun, but here's the thing. If you're right in front of somebody with a lasgun, all you have to do to render the weapon entirely pointless is get past the part that creates the powerful light. And that, obviously, is a hell of a lot easier if you're 1 meter away than if you were 100 meters away. In other words, to put it rather plainly, in close quarters combat, the Eldar's chance of survival and beating the human are drastically increased compared to their chances at long range. Though, of course, with that being said, that increase in advantage is wholly reliant upon the Eldar's ability to actually get into close quarters combat, and since delivering these specialists into hand-to-hand combat can be rather difficult on a modern battlefield, most Eldar will still utilize a ranged weapon, since that is simply a hell of a lot easier. In the case of the Eldar actually reaching close quarters combat, though, again, they're going to have a significant advantage on almost any enemy combatant. And, of course, last but by no means least, the moral implications. Standing and firing at somebody, fighting them at long range, is a frightening experience, but it is nowhere near as frightening as being charged by somebody. We've seen this time and time again throughout human history. Armies will be willing to stand and shoot at each other while suffering heavy casualties for extended periods of time. The reason behind this is good old-fashioned human psychology. When a large group of people are being shot at, they do not feel that it is a personal combat. They are not being shot at. The unit is being shot at. This is one of those strange ways the human mind works, which is why snipers were so effective during the First and Second World War. During the Second World War in particular, single snipers or small groups could hold up entire units for extended periods of time, despite the fact that if these units were faced with a normal fortified position, they could usually be relied upon to charge that position, despite the fact that you were far more likely to get shot then than by a sniper. The reason is, a sniper feels like a personal threat to you. The bullets are being fired at you personally. Whilst charging an enemy position, while still being very frightening, obviously, it is not a personal threat. The bullets are not being shot at you, they are being shot in your general direction. Hand-to-hand combat, however, is very, very different. It is a clear, present, and personal threat to you. When somebody is charging at you while swinging a sword, that is a very, very personal and obvious danger. And as a species, we humans are not particularly fond of clear and obvious danger. We tend to want to run away from such things. That urge to flee is, of course, also going to be rather reinforced by the fact that you're being charged by some Xenos monstrosity wielding a power sword and screaming at you at the top of its lungs in a volume so ridiculous that it's actually capable of fucking with your nervous system. To put it rather bluntly, yes, Howling Banshees are pretty effective as long as you can actually get them into combat. Now, obviously, they have their own ability to get into combat by being very, very fast and agile, being able to get out of the way of incoming firepower, etc. But generally speaking, when Howling Banshees are deployed by the Eldar, they want some guarantees. The Eldar don't like throwing lives away, especially considering what happens to those poor little souls should they be dead. With a little bit of luck, of course, they'll be absorbed by their soul crystal, but assuming that some rather asshole-ish person was to step on said crystal, well, that would be rather unfortunate for the poor Eldar. As such, Howling Banshees will almost never be deployed on their own. There will always be some form of delivery system, be that rapidly moving grab tanks, or some way of keeping the enemy's heads down or distracted for long enough for them to actually get into combat. Warp spiders, for example, might be jumping in all around the enemy, distracting them while the Banshees close. The grab tanks might swoop out of the sky and deliver the Howling Banshees directly into the heart of the enemy, or they might be suppressed by Reapers, etc. It should also be noted, though, that Howling Banshees are shock troops. They are supposed to get in and break the enemy quickly, then get the hell back out again. They are not ready for sustained combat. As you can probably imagine, it is rather tiring to jump around like a spastic person while trying to move oneself out of the way of incoming metal objects, be they fired from a gun or driven by the arm of a massive orc. And as we've already discussed, the Howling Banshee's body armor is not ready to take any kind of sustained beating. As such, any kind of lengthy combat scenario is not to the Howling Banshee's advantage. In fact, if they find themselves swamped down, they will quickly tire, run out of places to maneuver and jump to, and then get gunned down. They are a precision instrument meant to deliver death to a single target, just like the Banshees of Eldar legend. If extended combat potential is needed, that's what you've got the striking scorpions for, which I'm sure we'll also get to eventually. Until then, however, that is pretty much all you need to know about the Howling Banshees. So, until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.